Are we feeling happy? Are we feeling happy? My name's Robin Nusslock. I'm an assistant professor here in psychology, and I am absolutely delighted to welcome you to the keynote address of the 2014 Northwestern Symposium on Mind and Society. This symposium is a biannual event sponsored by the Psychology Department and the Weinberg College of Arts and Sciences at Northwestern. And the goal of this symposium is to really facilitate conversations within the Northwestern community as well as with the Chicago community more generally about issues that are critical to our society and our well-being. And I'd like to welcome you on behalf of myself as well as the Northwestern Symposium on Mind and Society Committee, including Professor Mark Beeman and Marcia Grabowecki. As part of the symposium, we had a phenomenal panel discussion this afternoon with really a truly eminent panel of professors on the topic of economic, social, and neural factors involved in generating well-being. This panel was moderated by Sandy Waxman and included professors Lindsay Chase Lansdale, Edith Chen, and we had a very special visitor, Professor James Heckman from the University of Chicago, who is the 2000 Nobel Laureate in Economics. Also included on this panel is our keynote speaker tonight, Richard Davidson. Richie is the William James and Vilas Professor of Psychology and Psychiatry at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where he's also the director of the Weissman Laboratory for Brain Imaging and Behavior, the Laboratory for Affective Neuroscience, and the Center for Investigating Healthy Minds. And I think it's safe to say that Richie is truly one of the most influential psychologists and neuroscientists in at least the last 50 years. Richie has spearheaded the development of a whole new field in many respects called affective neuroscience, which uses contemporary scientific methods to examine the emotional brain. As if developing one field wasn't enough, more recently Richie has spearheaded the development of a field called contemplative neuroscience, which examines the brain's ability to change itself through mental training and contemplative practices such as meditation. And this latter work has involved a close collaboration with the Dalai Lama that I'm sure you'll hear about tonight. Richie has been hugely productive in his career. He's the author of close to 300 peer-reviewed articles, the editor of 13 books, the author of a recent popular press book and New York Times bestseller, The Emotional Life of Your Brain. He's won numerous scientific awards. I obviously don't have the time to tell you all of them. A few highlights are he's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, a recipient of the Distinguished Scientific Contribution Award from the American Psychological Association, which is our field's highest award. In 2006, Richie was named one of the 100 most influential people in the world by Time magazine, and in 2007 Madison magazine named him the Person of the Year, and I would say that's an impressive resume. Personally, this is a very meaningful, it's very meaningful and an honor for me to introduce Richie because I did my undergraduate and my graduate work at the University of Wisconsin, and I would say that outside of my immediate family, there's really few people in the world that have had such a profound impact on my professional career as Richie Davidson. In fact, I can tell you the precise moment that I knew that I wanted to be an academic psychologist, which was in my sophomore year at the University of Wisconsin. In my first meeting in Richie's Laboratory for Affective Neuroscience, I walked out of that meeting, changed my major to psychology on that very day, and began my journey as an academic psychologist. So in a very real sense, I'm standing here in front of you today because of Richie Davidson. So please join me in a warm Northwestern welcome for Richie Davidson.
Thank you all very much. It's really an honor and humbling to be here with such a distinguished group of students and scholars. And I want to thank Robin particularly and all of my Northwest friends for hosting a wonderful event today. We had a terrific symposium this afternoon, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to continue the dialogue here this evening. This evening I'd like to just share in a little bit more detail some of the work which is particularly exciting to us these days. But before I do that, I think it's important to situate this work a little bit autobiographically. I'm a psychologist and a neuroscientist by training. And as I mentioned very briefly early today, I had the great fortune early in my career to be around some people whose demeanor and whose presence were very infectious to me. They were very warm-hearted people. They were people that I really felt attracted to. I wanted to spend more time around them. For the most part, these were not people in the academy. They were people that I was lucky enough to meet outside, although some of them were former members of the academy who were renegades doing other things. And I learned from them that they had an interest in and a practice of meditation, and this led me very early on in my career. Actually, after my second year of graduate school, this was at Harvard in the mid-1970s, to go off to India for the first time and experience for myself what this was about, a little taste of these practices. And I was in several silent retreats where it was kind of like meditation boot camp. And we were practicing very intensively for 12 to 16 hours a day for some period of time. And I came back with a clear conviction that these methods were important for modern science to investigate. They offered some potential for training attention, for cultivating emotional balance in some way, just based on my experience. And I came back with a fervent conviction to start doing research in this area, and in fact published a few papers very early on in my career on this topic. But it was made very clear to me, Richie, if you want a successful career in science, this is a terrible way to begin. And so I was a very dutiful student and pursued a career on the brain and emotion, which is still very much what I do today. And the work that we're doing on the impact of mental training and contemplative practices can be thought of as part of this rubric of work on the brain and emotion, because one of the key targets of these practices is to transform emotional and social skills. So just to flesh out these early years of history, when I went to India, I learned a little bit about meditation, and I started meditating myself. And for roughly almost 20 years, I was a closet meditator. I told very few people about my interests, and particularly kept this away from my colleagues in the academy. And I pursued my work on the brain and emotion, and all of that changed in a critical meeting that I had in the fall of 1992. I was invited by the Dalai Lama to meet with him at his residence in India. And the Dalai Lama had heard about some of the work that we were doing from some mutual friends, and he wanted to encourage serious neuroscientific investigation of the brains of Tibetan practitioners who has spent years training their mind. He was very curious to see whether our instruments of science can detect anything different about their brains. He also challenged me on that day, and he said, look, you've been using tools of modern neuroscience to study depression and anxiety and fear. Why can't you use some of those same tools to study kindness and compassion? And I didn't have a very good answer for him. It's hard. But it was hard when we first began to study fear and anxiety, and it was a wake-up call for me, and I decided on that day in 1992 that I was going to step out of the closet with my interests in this area and begin to pursue this in a much more serious and systematic way. And so we began to do a very unusual study, and we had a really amazing person recruiting participants for us for this study. And the recruiter was none other than the Dalai Lama himself. And he recruited expert practitioners, and we flew them to Madison, Wisconsin. These were people who resided mostly in India, Nepal, and other parts of Asia, lived in the Himalayan region. And we brought them to Madison to investigate things about their brain and behavior that may be interesting and unusual, and I'll share some of those insights today. Now, one of the reasons why the work in this area, I think, is gaining traction is because of four major themes that are important in modern neuroscience, biology, and psychology. And I'd like to share with you what those four themes are and why these four themes are so important in enabling this work to go forward. The first theme is neuroplasticity. I'm sure many of you have heard this word before. When I hear the word neuroplasticity, what I think about is the notion that the brain can change in response to experience. The brain is the organ that's designed to change in response to experience. And we've learned a lot about the different mechanisms of neuroplasticity over the years. And some of the greatest insights of modern neuroscience are fundamentally related to neuroplasticity. When I was a graduate student, we were taught that the brain is different from other organs in the body. We know that if we injure our skin, it will heal, and it heals because new cells are formed. And we were taught back in those days that the brain was different, that we're all born with a fixed complement of neurons, and the process of development was one of irrevocable cell death. We now know that that is just fundamentally and unequivocally wrong. A normal adult human brain generates somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 new cells a day. These cells are taken up into circuits, and they play a very important role in higher mental functions. This is known as neurogenesis. We know that stress can impair neurogenesis. We don't know whether mental practices affect neurogenesis. Neurogenesis is not something that can easily be measured in an intact brain. The key work has come from animal studies, although there is a definitive demonstration of neurogenesis in the human brain that I won't go into. It would take us into too technical details. But neuroplasticity provides a framework for understanding how the practices that are part of contemplative traditions that are designed to cultivate well-being and happiness might be achieving their effects, at least in part, through systematic changes in the brain. Now, the second theme is a theme that is similar to neuroplasticity, but in the realm of genomics, and that is epigenetics, the notion that the expression of our genes can be regulated by our experiences, by the environments in which we find ourselves, and also by the emotions and the specific practices that an individual might do. We published a paper in 2014. I may have a slide of the data from this coming up, where we showed that if we bring long-term meditation practitioners into the laboratory and we look over the course of 8 hours of practice at certain genes, particularly genes that are involved in inflammation, we actually see a systematic change over the course of just 8 hours in gene expression. We had a control group come in for the same period of time and have a day of leisure in the lab, where they were also sedentary, they were fed the same diet. We didn't see such changes in this comparison group. These are still very early days, but it suggests that gene expression may be very dynamically regulated and influenced by the kinds of mental practices that I'll be sharing a little bit more about in a few moments. The third theme is we've learned a lot about the massive bidirectional highways that exist between the brain and the body. These are pathways through which activity in specific circuits in the brain can influence systemic biology in ways that may be influential for health. And in turn, activity in the body can influence the state of our brains. Edith Chen and Greg Miller here are wonderful exemplars of the amazing work that really speaks to this issue. And this is an area where we think that there's going to be a lot of traction in the future because it suggests that practices that influence neural circuits that are important for well-being may not just influence our psychological well-being, but may have an impact on our peripheral biology, biology below the neck that may be important for physical health. And I'll share with you a little bit of data on this as we go along. Now, the fourth theme is probably the most controversial of these four themes, and I'll actually show you a little bit I'll amplify this theme a little bit more and show you a couple of slides to illustrate how this is looked at. But the fourth theme is a theme that I call innate basic goodness. And I will make the strong and controversial claim that human beings come into the world with an innate predisposition, a preference for altruistic, positive encounters compared with encounters that are selfish and aggressive. Now, it doesn't mean that the selfish and aggressive components are not in our repertoire, but it does mean that if we look at an organism, a young human organism, and give it a choice and ask what it prefers, it will prefer the pro-social choice that involves basic goodness. So let me now jump in and share a little bit more detail about this. This is just an inspirational picture. This is a picture of the Dalai Lama visiting our lab. He's now visited a number of times, but this was his first visit in 2001. And actually, we were showing him functional MRI, and there's a great story about this. I wanted a demonstration that really worked unequivocally. So we had one of my students lying in the scanner waiting for the Dalai Lama to arrive, and we were just going to do a very simple motor task and have the student move the fingers on his left hand so we can see the right motor cortex activated and vice versa. So that's what we did, and I instructed David, the student, to please move his fingers. You can see his fingers, and we were able to clearly see these differential patterns of activation in real time. And so the Dalai Lama said, "Can I ask him to do something?" So we said, "Sure." And he asked the student to simply imagine that his fingers were moving, but to not actually move them. Now, those of you who know this area of science know that there have been experiments of this sort that have been done. And much of the same circuitry that is activated by the actual movement is in fact activated by the imagined movement. And we did it, and the Dalai Lama actually saw that there were changes in the brain in areas that were overlapped with the changes with actual movement. And that was a very pivotal moment for him because he saw that pure mental activity without any behavioral output actually was reflected in patterns of brain activity. So on the issue of innate basic goodness, this is a study that was published in Nature a number of years ago, and I just want to show you two little video clips. Okay, so that's the first clip. Whoops, sorry about that. Okay, if you show these clips to 6-month-old babies, which do you think it would prefer? The data are very clear. And how do we determine the preference of a 6-month-old infant? Well, you ask them, but you ask them in a way where they can actually tell you, and we can ask them by monitoring their eye movements and looking to see where they prefer to look. And the data are quite clear. They prefer to look at the first one compared to the second one, and this is part of a whole genre of studies that I think can be interpreted to suggest that we come into the world with this fundamental preference. Now, this preference, I think, is something that requires nurturance. And the way I think about kindness and compassion is very similar to language. We all come into the world with an innate capacity for these skills, but it requires an appropriate community in which those skills need to be nurtured for them to flourish. So let me talk a little bit about compassion, because this is where we were particularly influenced by the Dalai Lama and his emphasis on compassion. And we brought these long-term practitioners into the laboratory, and these are all practitioners who spent many, many, many years. These are professional meditators, many years cultivating their mind in this way. The average number of lifetime hours of practice in the group that we studied was 34,000 hours of lifetime practice. You can do the math at home. 34,000 hours is a fairly large number. The range went from approximately 12,000 to approximately 62,000 hours of practice. So this was a rarefied group. And we decided to start with this group, even though there are many limitations to working with a group like this. Clearly, there are huge self-selection issues and all other kinds of problems. But if we didn't see anything with this group, we might as well pack it up and not try anything else, since these individuals have spent so much time engaged in these practices. And so how did we begin? Well, we brought these people in, and they have specific meditation practices that involve cultivating compassion. So what are they actually doing? Well, before I get to that, let me just say that in these early days, we did these incredibly simple experiments where we had practitioners alternate between a meditation period and a neutral period for very short periods of time. And one of the virtues of working with these long-term practitioners is that they, at least by their own reports, say that they can do these meditation periods even in the strange environment of lying in an MRI scanner for periods of time that are 2 or 3 minutes in length. And so that's what we did in this experiment. And in the words of one of the practitioners, this is what they were doing. So I'll read this to you. What we've tried to do for the sake of the experiment is to generate a state in which love and compassion permeate the whole mind with no other consideration, reasoning, or discursive thoughts. Now, you know how sometimes there are those commercials on television where it says in fine print, don't try this at home? Well, I would encourage you, please do try this at home, but don't be frustrated if it's difficult to do this without any reasoning or discursive thoughts that may be intruding. One of the virtues, at least by their own report, of working with these long-term practitioners is they're able to do this in a very undistracted way. So that's what we had them do, and we were simply monitoring what's going on in their brain. And this is one of the practitioners, and some of you who are involved in meditation may recognize this character. He's a very famous Tibetan Lama. He's written a popular book called The Joy of Living. His name is Mingyur Rinpoche. We are, in this picture, just monitoring his brain electrical signals. And what we observed is something that was very unusual. This is an actual slide from the paper that was published on this, which came out in 2004. The first author is Antoine Lutz, who is a scientist in our lab at the time. And you can see the resting state on the left and the meditation period on the right. And what's remarkable is that you don't need any kind of fancy signal processing extraction to see that there's a difference between the neutral period and the meditation period. And the meditation period is filled with high amplitude gamma oscillations. These are oscillations that are fast frequency oscillations. They're in the range of 40 cycles per second. And there's a large neuroscientific literature on gamma oscillations. Gamma oscillations have been markers of synaptic plasticity in animal research that's been done. Gamma oscillations are also seen during certain periods of insight and focused attention. The other thing that is unusual about this is that we saw synchrony in these gamma oscillations across widespread regions of the brain. The phase of these gamma oscillations was synchronized across these widespread regions of the brain. And the honest truth is we still are learning about the significance of this. We do not know what the full significance of this is. We published a paper very recently showing that these gamma oscillations are also present during sleep in these long-term practitioners, particularly during stage 4 or slow wave sleep. These gamma oscillations are superimposed upon these slow wave rhythms, which actually is a very interesting observation and was something very important to see methodologically, because there are complicated issues with recording these gamma oscillations in the awake brain in terms of artifacts which may be introduced. So that's a whole other story, and it's very much an evolving question about the significance of these. So let me introduce you to another one of our long-term practitioners. This is a gentleman who has played probably the most important role in facilitating this work. His name is Mathieu Ricard. He is a Buddhist monk. He's been a monk since 1967. He also has a PhD in molecular biology from the Pasteur Institute, where he worked with François Jacob, the Nobel laureate. And so he comes to the table, so to speak, with quite unusual, remarkable credentials. In fact, I don't think there's another person on the planet quite like him. And at the time that Mathieu decided to leave his career in science and go to study in the Himalayas, he thought that his days of doing science were completely over. Well, the 2004 paper on the gamma oscillations that I described earlier was actually co-authored by Mathieu, and in part it's about his own brain. And he has been instrumental in facilitating this work, and the Dalai Lama loves to refer to Mathieu as his favorite guinea pig, because he's willing to try virtually any experiment, and clearly understands the process of science and the value of doing science. So we've used other imaging methods like MRI to probe the brain when participants are engaged in these practices. And one of the ways that we do this when people are engaged in these compassion practices is to present emotional sounds to them, particularly sounds of human suffering, and to see how the brain responds differently to these stimuli that depict human suffering when the practitioners are engaged in these practices that are designed to cultivate compassion. And I'll just very briefly show you one piece of evidence. This was published a number of years ago, and what is illustrated here in this brain image is a region of the brain that's receiving a lot of attention in the scientific literature on empathy, as well as many other things, emotion, and it's called the anterior insula. And what we see is that this region in the brain is modulated by the engagement in this compassion meditation practice. So if you look down here, the red lines are the long-term practitioners, the blue lines are age and gender match controls, and the solid red lines are when the practitioners are doing this meditation practice. The dotted lines are during a control condition when they're not explicitly practicing. And I simply want to use this to make one point, and that is that the insula, this region of the brain, is amplified in its activation in response to these emotional sounds when the practitioners are engaged in this meditation practice. The controls show no difference between when they're trying to meditate and this neutral period, whereas the long-term practitioners in red are showing a very large difference. So another domain that has been studied extensively is attention, and in the earlier symposium I mentioned this quote from William James. This is one of my favorite quotes in all of psychology. This was in William James's Principles of Psychology. He has a whole chapter on attention, and he said, "The faculty of voluntarily bringing back attention over and over again is the very root of judgment, character, and will. No one is compos sui if he have it not. An education which should improve this faculty would be the education par excellence. But it is easier to define this ideal than to give practical directions for bringing it about. And I should just say that the italics are in the original William James. I think if William James had contact with these contemplative traditions, he would have instantaneously seen that these are strategies for educating attention. And if we can actually educate attention, that may be an important building block for many other forms of learning. So what's the evidence for this? Let me just show you and illustrate it with one study. But first, I want to just show you, these are response time distributions in the language, in technical language. It's not really important that you know the details, but this is a histogram of reaction times of kids with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and this is a distribution of age-matched kids who are typically developing. And what you can see is that among the kids with ADHD, they have a much more variable response time distribution. This tail goes out much more than among the typically developing kids. And I want to use this to simply make the point that variability in reaction time in this kind of task is associated with problems in deploying attention and has been found to be associated with mind wandering and being distractible. And so the question that we asked is whether a simple form of mindfulness meditation can impact this specific parameter of attention. And what we found, if you look in these bars here, what we're looking at here is the impact of 3 months of mindfulness meditation training in practitioners. And among novices, they were practicing for just 1 week, but they were tested 3 months apart as well. And what we're looking at in this particular figure is the standard deviation of reaction time. It's a measure of reaction time variability, the same metric that I showed you with kids with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And lower numbers here mean better performance. It means less variability, more stability. And what you can see is among the practitioners, after 3 months of training, they show a significant decline in variability. Their attention is more stable. And among the novices who are just practicing for 1 week, they're not showing any change. And we also monitored the brain during this period, and there are corresponding changes in the brain that predicted these changes in this behavioral measure of attention. So I won't bore you with these details. Anyone who's interested can go to the paper. So I've told you about this work with long-term practitioners, 3 months of training, but the work with long-term practitioners fundamentally is scientifically unsatisfying. It's unsatisfying because we don't know who these people were when they first started to practice. A life of a monastic, after all, is a very rarefied and unusual life, and certainly those who make this choice have got to be different from the outset. And so there are all kinds of selection biases. In order to really provide more convincing evidence, we need randomized controlled trials where we take people who've never done these practices before, we teach it to them, we randomly assign them to groups, and we follow them over time. From a scientific perspective, those kinds of designs are absolutely necessary. And so we undertook a kind of proof of concept study a couple of years ago, which was published in 2013. The first author is Helen Wang, who was a graduate student in our lab at the time. And what we did in this study is to investigate the impact of this very simple form of compassion training. And I'm going to go through this in some detail because I suspect that many of you are wondering what this kind of compassion training may be like. And we did compassion training for 2 weeks where individuals practiced for 30 minutes a day. And we compared it to an active comparison group, a group of individuals who were randomly assigned to a condition where they were trained in cognitive reappraisal strategies to reappraise situations in a more positive way And this was taken directly from cognitive therapy. And the amount of training, the way the training was delivered was identical between these two groups. And the trainings in each case were designed by experts in each of these areas. So we had these 2 weeks of training. One of the unusual things about this is we delivered the training over the internet. Participants logged onto a protected website, and they received the guided practices on the internet. And obviously, this is probably not as good as receiving instruction in person, but this was a way for us to monitor how much they were doing it, and it afforded certain kinds of experimental controls, which were really a virtue. Okay, so what are the elements of this compassion training? Well, let me go through how this is done. Participants are asked to first bring a loved one into their mind and to visualize that person. It could be a family member. It could be a very, very close friend. It could even be an animal, a pet. And envision a time in that individual's life when she or he may have been suffering. And then cultivate the strong aspiration that they be relieved from that suffering. And we start with the loved one, and then we move on to themselves. We have the person visualize a time in their own life when they may have been suffering. And again, cultivate that strong aspiration that they be relieved from that suffering. We then have them move on to a stranger. And by a stranger, we mean a person whose face you recognize. It could be someone who takes a class with you, but you don't know much about them. It could be someone who works in the same office building, and you recognize them, but you don't know much about them. And just imagine a time in their life when they may have been suffering, and cultivate that aspiration again. We then have them move on to this category. A difficult person, someone who really pushes your buttons. Maybe not pushes them super strongly, but pushes them some. And one meditation teacher said that 1 hour of practice with a difficult person is equivalent to 100 hours of practice on all the other categories. Very important. And we then have them move on to all beings, as many individuals as they can possibly envision. We have them use phrases that they silently repeat to themselves, like, may you be free from suffering, may you experience joy and ease. Participants are asked to notice whatever visceral sensations may occur in their body as they're doing this. Sometimes people especially mention sensations around their heart. And participants are instructed to feel the compassion emotionally and not to simply repeat these phrases cognitively. And I won't go through the details of this study design, but participants are randomly assigned to these groups. They have an MRI scan before they receive the training. They go through 2 weeks of training, 30 minutes a day, and then at the end, they get another MRI scan, and we give them some economic decision-making tasks. And I won't, this is not the right forum to go into the details of these economic decision-making tasks, but one of the ideas here is to see if they behave more altruistically on tasks that can assess this kind of behavioral choice. And after 2 weeks of training, the compassion participants behave on a particular economic decision-making task that was the primary task that we used. They behave more altruistically. They exhibit more pro-social behavior compared to the group administered cognitive reappraisal training. And we also found that there were changes that occurred in the brains of these individuals when we compared the MRI scans from before to after the 2 weeks of training. There were changes in circuits that are important for quote, executive function in the prefrontal cortex, as well as in parietal cortex. There are also changes that occurred in circuitry that we know is important for positive emotion in the ventral striatum. And the changes that we see in the brain actually predicted the changes that we observed, the differences that we observed on the economic decision-making measure of prosocial behavior. So this study suggests that just 7 hours of training, which is the amount of training that was done, is sufficient to produce a change, a measurable change in behavior and a measurable change in the brain. I'm frequently asked, well, how long do these changes last? And the answer is we don't know, but my conjecture is they're not going to last very long if people don't continue to practice. It's like having a person go to the gym and work out intensively for 2 weeks, and then if they stop doing physical exercise, how long are those changes going to last? And I think the same is probably true here. So let me say a few words about peripheral biology. We did a study a number of years ago, which was the first randomized controlled trial of mindfulness-based stress reduction. And one of the things that we did in this study is at the end of the study, we gave everyone in the mindfulness group and everyone in the control group a flu shot. And we measured the antibody titers mounted in response to the flu vaccine. And this is what we found. After 2 months of mindfulness meditation training, the meditators showed a bigger boost, if you will, in their antibody titers to influenza vaccine compared to the controls. Suggesting that if these individuals were exposed to the same level of flu virus, the participants who went through the 2 months of mindfulness training would have more protection that was conferred. I mentioned the epigenetics work earlier. This is from this new paper of ours which recently came out. The first author is Perla Koloman, who's a molecular biologist in Barcelona. This is just illustrating one particular gene, which is a gene that is important in the inflammatory cascade. And it's simply showing changes over the course of 8 hours. The meditators are in red, the controls are in blue, and it's showing a significant downregulation of this gene over the course of this 8-hour period. The controls, as I mentioned, are in the lab for 8 hours of a day of leisure, and the meditators are doing what they would do if they were on a typical retreat, where they're alternating between meditating in a seated posture and doing walking meditation practice. Now, some of you probably know this paper. This is from a group at Duke University who have been following a cohort of individuals who live in a town in New Zealand, Dunedin, New Zealand. They've been following this cohort from birth. And this particular paper is looking at the relation between early childhood measures of self-control, like the delay of gratification, and later adult outcomes. And some of the adult outcomes that they're looking at include, ones on the left panel here, are ones that have to do with health and substance abuse. And on the abscissa is a measure of childhood self-control. And what we see is that when kids are 4 and 5 years of age, those who are low in self-control, when they're 32 years of age, have higher levels of substance abuse. One of these curves is informant-rated substance use. So this is not a self-report measure. It's a fairly hard-nosed measure, and it suggests that there's a gradient that you see based on this measure of childhood self-control. So this is looking at the relation between measures of self-control at 4 and 5 years of age and outcomes when the individuals are 32 years of age. On the right panel here is various measures of financial planfulness and socioeconomic status and actual income. And what was found here is that those, again, who are in the lowest quintile of self-control when they're 4 and 5 years of age are doing the worst when they're 32 years of age in terms of actual income, in terms of measures of financial planfulness, and this is carefully controlling for other confounding variables. Finally, this is a measure of adult criminal convictions. And what you can see is that kids who are in the lowest group of childhood self-control when they're 32 years of age actually had the highest number of adult criminal convictions. Now, I'd like to read you one sentence from the abstract of this article, where they said in the last sentence of the abstract, interventions addressing self-control might reduce a panoply of societal costs, save taxpayers money, and promote prosperity. So what might those interventions look like? So we have, based upon studies like this, as well as the inspirational work of Jim Heckman, who we were fortunate to learn more from this afternoon, we developed a curriculum for preschool kids that we call the Kindness Curriculum, and we are now evaluating the impact of this curriculum in public schools in Madison, Wisconsin, in the context of serious randomized controlled trials. We randomize kids by classroom, and let me just share with you a little bit about what this curriculum is. We have the curriculum in both an 8-week and a 12-week version. These are some of the topics that are covered in it. It includes exercises in mindfulness and kindness, and if there's enough time, I'll show you a little video clip at the end which illustrates how this is actually done in the classroom. So these are just some other practices, gratitude practices, interconnectedness with people and the planet, and so forth. And let me just say that we're still in the very early stages of this work. We have an initial publication coming out in the next few months. It'll be our first publication on the impact of the kindness curriculum in this randomized controlled trial. It's very modest in terms of sample size. This involves about 200 kids at this point in time. There's a lot more work that we have to do, and I don't want to oversell this. On the other hand, I think we have a moral obligation to try and to see if these kinds of interventions might produce some beneficial effect. So this is just data on delay of gratification, one of the constituents of self-control in the Caspian-Moffat paper that I just showed you. And it shows that kids who were in the kindness curriculum, that's KC here, compared to kids who get the standard curriculum, are showing bigger gains in self-control over the course of this curriculum compared to the controls in different measures of self-control. We also have a sharing task that we call the self-other sharing task. We give kids something that is really potent currency for a 4- and 5-year-old, which is stickers. And we simply ask them to divide the stickers on different trials between themselves, an envelope that we label me, and an envelope that has a picture of another child. And we have a picture of their best friend. We obtain this information from sociometric ratings that we do in the classes. We have a picture of their least favorite person, kid in the class. And then we have a picture of a stranger child that they've never seen before, and we have a picture of an obviously sick-looking child, which is depicted here. And here's what we find. So this is just showing these different categories. It turns out that if you look at the controls, at least in Madison, Wisconsin, over the course of preschool, controls who get a standard curriculum become increasingly selfish over the course of the semester. That is, they give fewer stickers to others and keep more stickers for themselves. That's what you see, this significant change here among the controls. So this is for their least favorite person. This is for a sick child. Among the kids in the kindness curriculum, they are at least not getting more selfish. They're not getting more altruistic, but they're not getting more selfish. Whereas the kids in the control condition are giving fewer stickers to these other categories. It turns out, much to my amazement when I first began, kids in preschool receive grades. And they are graded by their classroom teachers. And this is just the grades in kids who receive the kindness curriculum and kids who are in the waitlist controls. That's what this stands for. And this is different categories on which they're graded. And on a number of these categories, the kids who receive the kindness curriculum are receiving significantly higher grades compared to the controls. So another thing that I wanted to mention, I'm not going to show you any data on this because we are still in the process of analyzing this, but with funding from the Gates Foundation, we've been developing video games for adolescents. One game to teach them skills of mindfulness and another game to teach them skills of empathy and pro-social behavior. It comes from the conjecture that we can actually build games that are as compelling for kids to play, that do not involve shooting other people, and that actually have potentially useful pro-social consequences. So one game we call Tenacity, which is our mindfulness game, and it's based on a series of experiments that we've done in our basic research using breath counting as a metric of mindfulness. And so the way it works is that kids tap an iPad with each breath cycle, and they tap with 2 fingers every nth breath, maybe every 5th breath. And it turns out when you tap with every 5th breath, children as well as adults make mistakes. Those mistakes happen to be associated with periods of mind wandering, and you can use that as a game mechanic to reward kids for stringing together more and more sequences of correctly detected breaths. And as they do that, these landscapes become increasingly populated with beautiful flowers and other attributes, and there are different environments that the kids can navigate in. We've done lots of play testing, and we just finished collecting data on a large randomized controlled trial that involved 200 kids who were 8th graders who were randomly assigned to one of 4 different game conditions, and we did MRI scans before and after each of these, each period of roughly 2 weeks of game playing. We also had expert advice from our contemplatives who gave us input on these games. The pro-social game is called Crystals of Cador. It's a much more complicated game, and it involves the scenario of landing on an alien planet, and you've got to interact with these aliens. They don't speak your language, but they have very human-like facial expressions, and you need to correctly detect their facial expressions and then help them to solve challenges that they encounter in their environment. This is what their faces look like. The faces are animated in an anatomically realistic way that's based on Paul Ekman's facial action coding system, and part of the task for the player involves calibrating by sliding a finger on the iPad to calibrate their ratings of intensity of these different emotions that are displayed by the aliens. So let me now end. How many more minutes do I have, Robin? Well, this video will take 6 minutes, so we'll end with this. And let me just set the stage for this video. This is an excerpt, it's actually a trailer from a documentary film called Free the Mind, which was made by a Danish filmmaker about some of the work we're doing in our center. And it featured the work we're doing with the kindness curriculum with preschool kids, as well as completely different work with veterans who are coming back from the Middle East and Afghanistan and Iraq who are suffering from post-traumatic stress symptoms, where we're using some of these same strategies to investigate their potential utility in helping to ameliorate some of these symptoms. So this is a little trailer from this film that focuses on the work with the kids.
We'll meet you at the next floor, okay?
We have elevators, right? I know that you didn't have a good time in one of them, but your mom and dad weren't in there with you, right? How about you and I will take the elevator one time, and then, but then listen, take a deep breath. It's okay. Do you need a hug?
Okay.
It's okay. It's okay.
There's 2 bathrooms open for you.
We're going to do the elevator.
There are different parts of the brain that become active when we have feelings of sadness and feelings of frustration and feelings of happiness. And we can change our brains for the better.
Breathing in and exhaling, dropping the trunks down. Just going.
The challenge for us and Will, the doctor that we met with, he recommended medication for Will. It was...
clearly ADHD, and he was recommending Ritalin.
And for us to put a 3-year-old or 4-year-old on Ritalin was not the path we wanted to go on. And we're looking at alternative ways for him to bridge his development to get beyond the need for that.
Now we're going to watch our breathing.
Social emotional learning is teaching kids how to be more emotionally intelligent. So teaching kids to take the perspective of others before they act, and being more self-aware, knowing what their emotions are.
So developing sort of empathy.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Hey, that was mine. She gave it to me.
What happened, buddy?
Does it feel tight in here? Yeah, put your hand, show me with your hand how it feels inside. Where does it feel tight? Right there? And in your throat. Okay, watch me. Put your hand on your belly and take in a breath with me. You ready? Blow it out. Go ahead, tell him how you're feeling when you see him so sad. Sad? You feel sad too? Show me where in your body you feel sad. Right here. Right here you feel sad in your body. Doesn't feel so good, does it? When you pay attention, what happens to your body? Does it get all busy? No. No, what happens to your body when you're paying attention? Quiet. Get slow. You can pay attention on the outside and you can pay attention on the inside. So the first thing we're going to do today is pay attention on the inside. Is everybody ready? This is for you. It's very cool, isn't it? Shake it up really hard, like as if you were really mad or really angry. Now, this jar is like your mind when you're angry and upset. And then we see the angry thoughts settling down.
We can actually be happier people. We can suffer less if we take responsibility for our own mind.
Well, I heard that when you go by elevators, that gets you really, really angry or really upset. Is that true? How does it feel on the inside when that's happening?
Scared.
It feels scared? I'm wondering if we could walk over by the elevator together. Is that okay?
No what?
And then shake this up when you start feeling scared on the inside. Is that okay? Great. Here, you carry it. Okay, we're getting close to the elevator. How does it feel in your body?
Good.
It does? So I'm wondering, maybe another day, could we take that mind jar with us and take a ride on the elevator? Another day or today?
Another day.
All right. What do you think about that mind jar?
Good.
Do you think that we should leave it at school so that if you're feeling angry or upset, that you could maybe shake it?
It's brainwashing for a good cause.
No, I wouldn't say that, because brainwashing usually implies that the person who is being brainwashed is not agreeing to this process.
Breathing in, breathing out. Breathing in, breathing out.
How about today, you can choose one friend and we'll all go to the elevator together. You can bring your snow globe. We can go inside
And do what?
and take a look at the elevator. And if you want to ride, we can. If you're not ready, then we won't go up.
I'll try it. I'll try to ride.
You will? All right, my friend.
Can I hold your hand in the elevator?
Oh, of course you can.
Well, I'm a little bit scared.
Okay. And remember, what does the snow globe do for you?
Make me cool.
Yeah.
Oh, what's on me?
Of course. And if you feel worried, what can you do with the snow globe?
Shake it.
Shake it up. Yep.
Why?
Okay, now watch this. How does your mind and your body feel right now?
Calm.
Good.
I'll give you a lot of power. I'll give you all the power I got.
So, if you want to learn more about, thank you. If you want to learn more about the work in our center, please visit our website. The compassion training that I described to you is available on the website for free download, so any of you can try it. And finally, I want to end with a quote that has been very personally meaningful to me. But before I do that, I've mentioned a number of people, and really this is in many ways the most important slide. I feel blessed every day to have an amazing team. This is just a small segment of them. This is something that was written by Albert Einstein in 1921 in a letter that he wrote to a friend. The friend was asking him for some advice about a difficult situation with his daughter. And Einstein said, "A human being is part of a whole, called by us the universe, a part limited in time and space. He experiences himself, his thoughts and feelings, as something separated from the rest, a kind of optical delusion of his consciousness. This delusion is a kind of prison for us, restricting us to our personal desires and to affection for a few persons nearest us. Our task must be to free ourselves from this prison by widening our circles of compassion to embrace all living creatures and the whole of nature in its beauty." Thank you.